This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are super excited to give a big shout out and thank you to two new supporters of our show, Jessica and Madeline. We appreciate it so much. Anytime you can show us some love, it lets us know we're helping you to grow as writers, giving you a sense of community, something worth doing, right?
And also it makes you feel like you're not shouting into the void as well. So thank you very much.
Yes, indeed.
Indeed. So thank you. And if anyone else out there feels like showing some support, there are buttons at storyworkspodcast.com. They link to PayPal. No amount is too small. This is a labor of love for us, but there are out-of-pocket costs with hosting, distributing, and production. So thank you again to Madeline and Jessica. And today we are talking about the role of agency in making a story satisfying for your reader. So, reader satisfaction, what is the pitfall? How do we let readers down if we don't have agency? Let's start with that side of the coin.
Yeah, I think if things happen too easily in the story, so even if a character has agency, it's only employed mildly because things fall into their lap. I think we expect our characters to have to work to solve the story's premise, hook, and inciting incident. Otherwise, why read the book? Why invest all that time? And if you invest all that time, and the character appears not to do anything, but stuff just happens to them, that can feel shallow. It doesn't mean it isn't necessarily. Doesn't have entertaining elements in the story. I think, we've all read stories where, and in fact, why not? We're told to put our characters in a big mess and stick them up the tree and throw stones at them and then set the tree on fire and introduce dinosaurs and whatever. So at some point they're supposed to be helpless, but if they remain helpless or they don't save themselves or solve one of the many issues that arise, we tend to feel a bit cheated. I think that, why are we following that character in the first place? So I went bigger than your initial question, but I think you want to feel as if the character had some part in resolving what the inciting incident set off.
Right, absolutely. I mean, agency is all about giving your character the opportunity to make choices and then face the consequences, positive and negative, that come out of those choices that our protagonist makes. And if you're just buffeted by the storm, then, as you said, Robert, what's the point of reading the story? I think we live in a society, in a world where we want to feel like we have some control over our fates. It's not predetermined, and we do have choice and free will and opportunity, and we get to make mistakes. And if a character isn't fulfilling all of those things on this journey we call story, then I guess the story feels a little hollow, or it rings untrue, or maybe it feels too much like some of our real life moments and we want that vicarious sense of ownership and control.
That's a good point too. I think there's that sense that we're sometimes unable or caught up in our own indecisiveness or inability to battle external circumstance, that when you plunge yourself into a story, you don't necessarily want to feel as if the character can't decide for themselves or make choices that support what they want to do or the thing that they're battling against. And again, not too easily. So you don't want to have it solved in the first chapter.
Right.
And I was thinking, you offline, we mentioned, we were just talking about Molly McClure's excellent series of interviews we did, where we briefly mentioned agency and memoir. And I'm thinking as well, again, that one of the difficulties with memoir is slipping into a journalistic or a diarised sense of, well, this happened, and that happened, and this happened, and that happened, and this happened, and that happened. And that might be interesting if it's a famous figure or a celebrity that we're, or a historical figure that we want to know something about their daily life. But for the most part, I think for many people writing memoir, the trick is to bring their agency into it so it becomes interesting to read. So we understand the consequences of what they were dealing with when they made that fateful decision to take that job overseas or whatever it was. It wasn't just something that happened. So I think, to me, it's a very fine line between this happened and that happened and this happened and that happened. And it's a little difficult to separate that in fiction, much more obvious in memoir because it ends up reading like you're reading someone's diary. But in fiction, it can still seem exciting, it can still seem action-packed, but the average reader might not realise, understand where the satisfaction is coming from. Because, it turned out that the answer was in that letterbox that was, hidden in the attic for decades, and nobody did anything to find it, So,
yes.
A coincidence, I believe coincidence plays a big role in story. There's no question about that. And so you've got causal or you've got coincidental, but your character must make choices based on that.
Yes. Yeah. If things happen coincidentally too much, or if the coincidence is too big, plays too big of a role in your story, then you get into the territory of Deus Ex Machina, the hand of God, where things are happening to the character without any of that agency, that kind of predetermined, fated Greek tragedy notion of something is going to be no matter what the character does. And so the character's role in a modern story can feel pointless. We need to feel that the character's movement through the plot is purpose-driven. That's why we put so much attention on the protagonist's motivation and the obstacles on the way to the goal. That's really about setting up situations that give our character choices to make, for better and for worse, because as you said, Robert, we don't want it to be too easy. Maybe you have a swashbuckling hero on a romp of an adventure, but we still expect some pitfalls, some foibles, some time in the dungeon, some, something to go awry as part of the fun. Kathryn, you're nodding so much. I'm just...
I totally had to mute my microphone because I had, sirens going all over.
Oh, no.
I think that there's pitfalls on both sides of this where you can make it too easy. My character just accomplishes what they want, or you can make them so stupid that they never accomplish anything, right? So you can kind of fall off on the wayside on both sides to dissatisfy the reader. So they can do nothing. And why was this character the center of my world for the last 300 pages? I don't understand. Or they can do everything, but it's all wrong. And it frustrates you the whole time because this character doesn't deserve what they end up with in the end, right? So I think for me as a reader, I want to feel like that character deserves it. And for me, that's kind of my measure. It's easier for me to wrap my brain around, do they deserve it? Than some of the other kind of measurements of agency. Did they earn the right to this victory?
So when you say deserve, do you mean deserve in the sense of, is this person good enough to be rewarded, or do you mean deserve as in worked hard enough to get there?
Yeah, it's can you follow it back to where you say, yes, okay, this character earned it, this character deserves the victory that they have now accomplished. And again, there are tiers of victories throughout your book that you want them to accomplish, that you want them to earn. And if they're earning them too easily, then they don't deserve it. And if they're not doing what they should be doing and they're getting it anyway, then that's where my dissatisfaction really takes over, and I will just stop reading a book because it's I just don't care that they have this victory. It doesn't make sense. It's not earned for that character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? You want the agency to be in line with the psychological profile of that character. It's, we talk about suspending disbelief, and sometimes that comes from, why did they do that? I mean, that's just not in character at all. So the author's given them agency to try and orchestrate a particular plot point, but to the reader that just seems far-fetched or so out of character that you lose interest. And as you say, Kathryn, that could be because they just didn't earn the small or large victory that they accomplished, or it just didn't make sense. All right, whatever.
Yeah, I think there's the psychological piece you mentioned, Robert, and there's also the physical piece too. Have you ever read a scene where a character wins a battle and you're like, you don't have that skill set, or you didn't show me you're strong enough or trained enough or skilled enough, and so part of that journey of agency, I think, is setting up the character's abilities before we get to those moments when the character has to win or lose, but go into that conflict. And if we don't feel it's earned, to go back to that word that Kathryn introduced into the conversation, then we lose faith in this character. And I think that ties into agency. It doesn't feel like agency if it doesn't feel earned, whether for a psychological reason or a physical reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in particular, I think when a story becomes brilliant is when the opening moments or the opening parts of the story in their ordinary life show that agency being defeated or not working out for them, or going against their conscious goals, getting in the way of what they really need. And then when we come to the denouement or the climax, all of a sudden they're forced to employ their agency in a different way, but in a way that cements a growth element of the character. And those I think are truly satisfying stories. It appeals to your sense of completeness, your sense of the hero's journey, if you want to tie it back to that as well. There's lots of psychological reasoning behind why that's so satisfying. So when the agency makes complete psychological and physical sense, so they've either had to employ the skills or they've had to learn something they didn't know they needed to learn in order to then pick the right decisions at the end, then we have a truly satisfying story, I think, or potential for it anyway.
Right. That journey from the opening where you see the hero before Act 2 is launched, right? Before that hero's journey actually begins, and we need to see all of that growth and evolution through Act 2, and there's this process of continually choosing to confront the obstacles. So part of that agency is the hero saying, do I choose to go forward? You have to give your hero reasonable options, and it can't always be go home. Fight or go home, but there have to be enough forks in the road where our hero makes choices, and not all of them are successful, in order to show that evolution that gets us to the climax.
Yeah, and I first heard about this in Story Grid, but I think it comes from before that, is the idea that you throw your character a best bad choice. Or incompatible good choices. So they can do this one, but if they take choice A, then choice B gives pain to some aspect of their life or other character. And then the best bad choice is, damned if you do, damned if you don't type of thing. So so I think and I read somebody else saying that all the story is a series of dilemmas, and I've used that before myself when I've been confused about where to take a plot or a character in the early days of the world. Okay, I've got to give them a dilemma, because that way we feel something about the choices they have to make. So that can be a handy tool. I mean, it's not necessarily something you'd use all the time, but I like the idea that a good piece of fiction is just a whole series of increasingly difficult dilemmas.
Right, which is really just about the escalation in stakes and tension. What does my hero have to gain or lose by making this choice, by entering into this new situation? And if it's not escalating from the beginning to the climax, then the journey feels flat. It feels stale. And I think that happens a lot when agency isn't being employed the way it needs to be, to keep the reader feeling on board with this character.
If agency is given to circumstance, setting, or other characters, then you just sort of feel like it's, okay, all right, what's next then? And even though that may well be, for many of us, what life is like, there are other people making decisions for us. Emails arrive in the inbox that force you to do things. As I think, as you touched on, Alida, right at the start there's a really deep psychological, philosophical idea that we have free will, that we wish for control over our lives in times, and even more so in times where we don't. I mean, we're recording this in late 2020 when so much control and so much free will appears to have been taken away, and so people feel powerless. And that whilst that's something you want your hero to feel, you don't want them to be powerless. You want them to feel powerless. And there's a big difference between the two. And so I think you're digging into that whole idea of we want control over our lives, no matter how useless that pursuit might be. It's nice to have in a story.
Right. And I think it's important to keep in mind that in story, our protagonist is never entirely without control. That's because we're always working with choice, consequence, and action, reaction. So even when our protagonist seems to be in a moment of utter defeat, unless we're about to kill off our protagonist, there is a way out. And maybe that way out is a supporting character or a co-hero enters the scene, and then the two of them, make the escape or whatever. So sometimes we do have to put our hero into a situation where the hero can't get herself out alone, but she's still going to play an active part, right? Unless it's, a total rescue situation. I'm not ruling out the possibility 100%. But, as a rule, your hero is going to be the source of forward movement through the plot.
Right.
Yeah, I think things can be catalytic, can't they? So, it's fair enough if something then becomes available to the hero that then allows them to enable. So, if we've got side characters who become enablers but don't actually do the work for the hero, then that's perfectly fine. I still think that means we're laying the agency at the feet of the hero, because ultimately, without them, the plot wouldn't progress.
Right.
So, I like the idea that side characters do come in and act in, or things happen that enable. We just have to be careful that they're not too easy. But well said there. It's all about choice, consequence, and rising stakes.
Right. Not too easy, and not. I had another one, and now it just fled my mind. But thinking of the situation, not pointless, right? So let's say that your hero is completely incapacitated, about to be executed or something, and your, primary supporting character comes in and rescues the hero. So they escape, the hero licks wounds, recovers, whatever needs to happen. But out of that moment of defeat, there has to birth something that makes the hero stronger. So maybe the hero discovered the villain's Achilles heel while in that situation, or the hero discovered some inner strength that wasn't accessible before. So even if you do write in that total defeat moment where somebody else saves your hero, make sure that launches something new that is total hero agency.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Right, because agency doesn't have to be in every scene, every sentence thing, so much as it needs to be an overall trait of your character.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
So I have a question.
Excellent.
Earlier when we were talking about this topic, Robert, you mentioned that you could spot it like that in a synopsis. Like,
yep.
Hey, that is going to be a book with an agency problem.
Yep.
Like, how do you do that? And how can, like, me as a writer looking at my own work, like, take some of those tools to be able to spot it in my own work?
The most obvious place to start is in the climactic moment. So you work backwards. So how is the inciting incident, or whatever the story premise is, how is the problem that's set up for the hero at the start solved? So that's my first port of call. And if that's solved outside of the hero's control, then that's going to be an immediate problem. And if you're trying to, say, write a book description, which is often where I'm coming across these synopses, then my theory is that you write a book description that gives the hero front and center stage, but the reader might be upset because they've purchased a book that ultimately where the story's premise isn't solved by the hero themselves. Now, it may be a satisfying read, as I said, it might be quite entertaining. But the thing about synopses, I think, is because you compress everything down to just, say, 2 or 3 pages, it's so much easier to spot. So those moments, and then the other big clues are any other big turning point. I think it's okay for an inciting incident to employ no agency for a character, because stuff happens. So it could be causal, it could be something they chose to do, but it could be complete coincidental. But I think, as Alida said, if you just have a string of coincidences through the book, then that also then feels like you're robbing the character of any free will over what happens. So the other thing you look for is coincidences in the turning points. And then within the turning points, is it the hero that had some involvement in that, or is it just something that just happened? So not so just coincidental, but it was through another character's work, and that then doesn't lead the hero to then employ some skill of theirs to take what the other character did and move the plot forward with that, as the leader said. So it's really easy. I mean, and also passivness. Passivity. I don't know what you call it. A very passive
passivity,
character.
I think.
Passivity, yeah.
Yeah.
So if a character seems very passive, now again, it's easy to point the finger in a synopsis, because often in a synopsis it is very passive. It's a passive description. Otherwise, you'd be reading the book. So you're going to expect a little bit of that, but you're reading between the lines. Does this character seem very passive, or things just happening to them? Or are they out on a quest? So that's the other big clue as well. Don't know if that helps.
I think that's really useful, Robert. Another thing I see sometimes in my clients' storyboards is when they set up an antagonist who functions up until the climax, like the parish leader is just the thorn in the hero's side, and then suddenly a traveling salesman sweeps through town and murders your hero's mother or something. And you're like, well, wait a minute. That person has nothing to do with the parish leader. Like, you can't. You need to have your antagonist build, this conflict between the protagonist and antagonist needs to build, and you can't do a bait and switch just to push more drama into your climax. So
I was waiting for you to finish that with how the parish leader and the traveling salesman were connected, and then I realized that was the point.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
And therein lies your dissatisfaction for the reader. The dissatisfaction is exactly what Kathryn's feeling is. Yeah, and they were connected. How?
Right, exactly.
Right. And so, your protagonist's agency is building up to this climax, and we were talking at the beginning of the conversation about the psychological and physical development that the protagonist experiences on the journey to the climax, and so you can't throw in an outside force in the climax because then it's unrelated to the protagonist's journey. So even if the protagonist seems to have agency in saving the day in that climax, it's disjointed.
Right.
Yeah. So agency must always be contextual then.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. That's a nice insight. I would have come to that come to that conclusion eventually, thinking it through. But of course, it would have to be relevant to the antagonist is going to play a strong role in the main character's development of agency. So if you then throw in a different antagonist too late in the story, then we also rob the reader of satisfaction.
Right.
It's a deeper topic than you think, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's more to it than just you have to have agency in order to satisfy a reader. It's like you have to have agency the right way. You know what I mean? Your character can't just do stuff and be responsible for things. They have to do it and be responsible for the right things and in the right way.
At the right time. Are you ready to take your writing to the next level? Could you use the help of a developmental editor or writing coach? I work with writers at all skill levels and all stages of the writing process, both through project-based developmental editing packages and one-on-one, totally customized coaching sessions. Head over to wordessential.com/editing to see how I can help you grow your storycraft and become a more knowledgeable, skillful, exciting writer.
Oh my gosh.
It's everything. Well, it connects, we've connected agency to your character's motivation, to the obstacles your character is facing, to the relationship to the antagonist, to, the turning points in the plot, to, it's one of those story elements that is all pervasive and
interwoven.
Yeah, and you really lose that reader satisfaction if it's not present, because I think the psychological elements we were talking about that readers have for our characters, that desire to have some control, to play that game of moving through the narrative with the hero.
So how do you then write this if you want to portray a deliberately weak character on a journey? It could be an internal plot. It could be an internal arc where you want to write a weak character that becomes stronger or faces a fateful ending because they cannot overcome their weakness. That must be much more tricky to employ agency in that sort of scenario.
Yeah, I think you still have to give your character choices with consequences, but they're on a different level. They're subtle, they're internal. Even choosing not to respond to something or choosing not to act right is a choice that's going to have consequences that then need to ripple out through the rest of the story. And, unless your character is a hermit, they're going to have relationships, there are going to be things happening around them. So how is this character's seeming inactivity affecting other people? How does that come back at your protagonist? What do you want your reader to feel? Do you want your reader to agree with your hero's choices or to be frustrated by them? You have to keep your reader curious enough, fascinated enough by this character to want to go on the journey.
Yeah.
But you could be fascinated and find the character disagreeable and wish the character was doing things differently. On our What Are We Reading episode a few months ago, we talked about a man called Uva, And he's one of those characters who's so funny and bewildering that you stick with him even though he's being disagreeable. And then as his relationships evolve with people in his neighborhood, you start to discover his softer side, you learn his backstory, and you change your allegiance, you start to love him. Now, could you write that same story without the humor and without Uva evolving into somebody you actually like? It would be a very different book.
More
Maybe.
challenging to make it satisfying, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you would have to try to figure out what is interesting. Because if you can't get behind those choices, then what's going to keep you engaged?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's where your understanding of the character study elements come in really strongly, and an understanding of general human psychology and the needs, Maslow, all that sort of stuff. If you can paint the picture of somebody's own blind spot and make that intriguing to the reader, I guess that's that's a skill I'm not sure that I have, but there are clearly authors who do that really, really well. I think that's why I personally gravitate to more action adventure stories, because it's so much easier to write in terms of agency.
Yes. Right? Tobias Wolff's A Bullet in the Brain is a good short story where you've got a very unlikable character and he's standing in line at a bank complaining about everything going on around him. So he's literally doing nothing.
Right.
And some bank robbers come in and they shoot the character in the head. So something happens to him. I mean, he laughs at something the robber says, so you could call that agency, but it's kind of accidental. Agency is maybe a bit too generous for this character. And as the bullet travels through his brain, time slows way, 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 way down, and we see his life kind of flashing before his eyes. Experience, that's the bulk of the story. And only in the very last moment, when he's all the way back in his childhood, do we see something redeemable about him, and all those pieces fall into place. So I think if you wanted to work with that kind of character and play with these questions of agency, start with short fiction.
Yeah.
Sticking with someone who does nothing or is unlikable or who you can't get behind is easy to do in a short piece and can be fascinating, can be a great experiment. But even in that short piece, he doesn't leave this character completely unlikable. We have that moment right at the very end where he's redeemed a little bit, right? We still don't like grown-up Anders, but we see the passion that started his journey when he was a boy.
So I suppose the trick then is to begin with the end in mind with these things. If you're going to have, if you know you're going to have agency issues with your main character, is what is the moment, the decisive moment that we're going to portray for the reader that will give that sense of satisfaction. That this isn't just a story where things just happen to a person for no reason or for seemingly unrelated reasons.
Right, because that moment of redemption is what makes the story so satisfying. He goes from being a jerk who got shot to being a tragic figure in that one moment. Yeah. And that makes all the difference.
Clever. Yeah. Very clever.
Other thoughts on agency and reader satisfaction?
I think you left us with the perfect ending, actually.
There you go. I guess we're satisfied. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.